So we will start with some questions for James. So we'll continue on with his presentation. And James, as you anticipated, there are a number of questions that are related to the regionalization of packing plants or the decentralization of production. So you did speak to this a bit in your talk. Just wondering if you see, or do you expect to see, a revival of more regional packing plants located in various parts of the country?
Well, you have to have the animals there in the first place. I think, there's been an increase in direct sales from individual producers through a provincially regulated abattoir through to consumers. We even went out and bought some pork. I was not particularly impressed that it was allowed to graze outside. I worry about trichinosis. I think consumers have certain concerns with respect to the safety of provincially regulated plants. But the thing you have to keep in mind that there's a large segment of consumers that are driven by prices, and where the price reductions are going to come from the larger, more centralized operations. And that's where we've benefited from relatively low priced pork especially, but also beef. So there might be some room. I think a very good example of what happens is all of these different producer groups that attempted to set up regional plants after the border closures in 2003. They didn't work. We've had a couple of them come back, like Harmony, but you have a large investor, Vesta, who basically came from JBS in the States. He knew what he was doing. He had money behind him. Producer groups don't necessarily know how to disassemble animals.
Okay, thank you. I have two more questions for you, James, and then we'll move over to Ellen. So on the safety side, so you talked to some extent about the importance of sort of safety with regard to the production of animals. And there was a question about the protection of humans within these packing plants as well. One person was wondering if you know the kinds of measures, are you aware of the measures that were put in place to protect people from COVID within the packing plants themselves?
Yeah, well, there've been a couple of things. There's been some government money that has come for protective measures. They've attempted to slow down belt speeds on plants. They've set up protective areas around them. They've put in protocols about sort of washing of hands and various things. So yeah, the sector is open to a bit of criticism, but given the absolute size of the shock, I think they've been able to deal with it relatively well. They've been able to come back, but there will be pressures in the long run, and I see those pressures going towards sort of more capital intensive processes where human health isn't affected. And I think it becomes a problem with certain groups. My wife's family were displaced persons coming out of the Second World War. They worked in beef pack or in hog packing in Alberta. There's a whole community that has grown out of that. There are communities in southern Alberta that sort of are able to establish a life in Canada. There are pluses and minuses to this. It's not straightforward.
James, at one point recently, you had mentioned that robotics might also be part of the future of packing plants. Did you want to comment on that?
Well, I don't really know enough about it. I think there was at one point someone from AFNS who can probably comment a lot more on it. The problem, as I see it, so Jason Lusk has, we provided a link to him. In his blog, he has a film of a robotic processing plant with respect to sheep and lambs. The problem is that you need to have very consistent animals going through. And there's attempts to have them as homogeneous as possible, but they're not. And if you have a situation where you're holding animals back, they put on a lot of weight, and that's going to create even additional problems. So robotics are there. How far into the future, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. One more question for you, James, and then we'll move over to Ellen. There's a question about the oversupply in the dairy sector. Lots of news stories about the dumping of milk, for example. So how does the dairy sector resolve this issue? Is dumping of milk the only option? And are there options with regard to, humanitarian approaches, distribution of this product in other ways throughout a local economy?
Well, I think you have quite different systems in the US and Canada. In Canada, you have marketing boards. They take control of the product as it leaves the farm gate. They have a bit of flexibility between moving it between plants. So you can move milk into plants making storable products, butter and skim milk powder, and pick up the surplus. So the government has increased the lending ability of the Canadian Dairy Commission to make more intervention purchases and more storage purchases for both butter and cheese. I think they've added it back. We've regressed another 40 or 50 years into this strange system of supply controls that we have, but it tends to work. Where you saw most of the media was in Wisconsin. The U.S. has a problem in terms of just the level of supply that they're producing at the moment. So there is some sort of a combination of just how much they're actually producing and then these surges. I suspect it's a lot less damaging to see a bit of milk spilled on a field than it is to see wiener pigs gassed.
Right. Okay, thank you, James. I think we might come back to some other questions later on about the challenges of lower demand and how farmers might be able to deal with that with other commodities as well. But we'll move over to Ellen now for a series of questions related to her talk. Ellen, there are a series of questions. Actually, the top question that I see currently is related to direct marketing, direct from farm marketing, or non-traditional routes, community supported agriculture, home gardening. So do you think that these sort of non-traditional supply chains or alternative supply chains could become more significant, or should be, or likely to become more significant going forward?
Thanks, John. One of my favorite topics. I absolutely think that we're going to see lots and lots of interest in direct farmer purchases from certain segments of the population. I'm also recognizing, though, that lots of people have been living in very unusual circumstances for the last 2 months. So, for example, they've been in the house with their family, and nobody has been leaving the house at 8 o'clock in the morning and coming home at 6 o'clock at night and worrying about putting meals on the table in quite the same way. So I think people are a little bit afraid of a lot of things right now. So they're looking for ways that they can buffer themselves. So that's part of the interest in more gardening and more support for, I was really pleased to see that community gardens were allowed to open up in most communities in Canada, whereas at the beginning of all of this in March, we were seen to be not possibly having community gardens, which would have been a big blow to many people. I've seen really aggressive responses by farmers who are used to supplying the local food markets right across the country. way over in Nova Scotia, there were some farmers who realized very quickly that they were not going to have a farmer's market to go to, so they restructured their driveways so that they could have a click and collect point for people to come out from the city and have a nice drive and pick up their click and collect stuff without any contact with people. Very early on, we've seen farmers markets move online right across the country so that they can take orders from people and be able to supply them. I think the farmers that are interested in working in that area have been super entrepreneurial in getting themselves online in a variety of ways. And I do think that a lot of those types of purchasing are going to stick once people realize the choices they can have and how different the product might be. So I think I see that as a plus out of all of this in a variety of ways, particularly for people who are interested in the attributes of the food products that they buy, and being able to speak to the farmer to give themselves an added sense of security about what type of production they're actually supporting.
Okay, thank you. I've got another question that I know is very close to your interest. Will changes from COVID translate to increased food literacy?
I'm hoping so. Right near the beginning, one of the first interviews I had to give, I was saying that cooking is such a great way to teach chemistry, to teach math, to teach a few other things, that maybe people who were stuck in the home having to educate their children and work and put meals on the table at the same time would combine some of these activities. And everything that I've been monitoring since, in the media and in other studies that people have done in other countries, would suggest that's the case. And I think there's very few children of the age of my son, who's now in his mid-30s, who would have ever had 2 months at home being involved in preparing meals before. So I'm hoping that we generate long-term interest in food and where it comes from and how to prepare it. But we also increase people's understanding of food quality and the whole schmear of nutrition, health, literacy, and diet.
Okay, thank you. One more question for you, Ellen, and then we'll move back to James. There's a question about remote communities, communities that are further away from some of the major food markets. And perhaps this is more speculation. I'm not sure if you've seen much data on this, but what do you think the impacts are going to be on remote communities in Canada and other parts of the world?
A couple of things. James had a little chart on one of his slides about where the breakdowns have been in the food supply chain. And I think things could have been a lot worse if all the people who deal with the logistics of moving food from one place to another had gotten sick at the same time as some of the people got sick in food processing. I think it will be devastating for smaller communities, which has already happened in some places in Canada, where the one grocery store has had to close due to COVID-19 outbreaks. In some of those places, we've been able to get those locations back up online, back up and running relatively quickly, but we're very, very vulnerable to people's health. On the other side of the coin, if we are going to see income shocks, if we're going to see some of the resource industries affected by illness so that they shut down for periods of time, as well as people do in meat processing. So we've had some areas of northern Saskatchewan, for example, where people working in the resource industries have generated quite a bit of illness among their own staff and had to close down those facilities. Then we start to have income effects, and then we have food security effects. If in the end, some of the supply responses that James talked about, which are going to be right throughout the supply chains, not just in the area of meat, start to affect food prices so that they stay at higher levels, then we really have to worry about isolated communities in the north. And we will have to worry about vulnerable populations globally. James didn't mention it yet, although it may come up in later talks, but some countries are proposing not to allow exports of product because they're worried about domestic food security rather than satisfying export markets. And those kind of things can really escalate food prices globally if they start to really bind certain markets, such as rice, for example. So yeah, food security is a huge issue, and I think we need to be worried about it and keep on monitoring it and paying attention. And we need to do that for vulnerable populations in all our communities in Canada, as well as in our isolated northern and rural communities.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. So we'll move back to James, but this next question I think could be answered by either one of you. James, you talked quite a bit about the beef supply chain and packing plants, but there's a top question here about seafood processing. So I'll just read it to you. I'm curious if you know of the trends for seafood processing. I've heard that some old processing facilities have been, quote, dusted off, reopened across British Columbia, for example. Do you see these trends being maintained in the long term or shifting back to normal, for example, focusing on international trade?
Okay, I don't know much about seafood. I suspect one of the issues is that the plant is a refrigerated unit and you're going to have people in close quarters, and all of the problems that you'd see in beef or pork packing would occur. Bringing back mothballed plants, going back to 2003, I was at the University of Manitoba at that point in time. There were discussions about trying to bring back mothballed maple leaf plants in Manitoba. None of these things have worked very well. I would further state that with respect to beef, the existing plants that we have now are getting quite old. I tend to think of them as being relatively new because they've been around for a long time, but they've been in existence. So a lot of these, it's not a simple matter of bringing back a mothballed plant. Certainly, yeah, seafood is one of our bigger exports, but along with beef and pork, and we face some challenges. I am particularly worried about increased protectionism across all countries. Ellen raised the issue of export restrictions. In 2008 to 2012, especially in the wheat market, there were extensive use of export restrictions and huge price surges. So I will talk about that next Monday, as will the person from IFPRI as well.
Okay. Ellen, did you want to say anything more about seafood processing?
It's interesting that it is certainly being affected globally, so not only in Canada. And there have been incidents of seafood processing plants having flu outbreaks and closing down as well. Also, some of the seafood markets are largely being affected by the fact that some types of seafood are pretty expensive, and served through restaurants. So the demand side has definitely shifted for seafood rather more dramatically than some other foods that we eat equally at restaurants and at home.
Okay, thank you. So I'll ask a question of you, James. There is a question here about the implications of closed borders with the United States. And I know you'd mentioned in your presentation that our relationship with the US is incredibly significant in this sector. And there has in recent months, recent weeks, been some discussion in the White House about possibly closing borders for this kind of trade. So the question is, what would a decreased livestock trade between Canada and the US have on Canadian meat supply, Canadian price?
Just go back to May 2003. You had a closure of border everywhere. So we had live animals couldn't go. We had, boxed beef, primal cuts couldn't go. So we had a dramatic, 60% reduction in cull cattle prices. That was the biggest impact. It's quite different this time around, but there are all kinds of lessons to be had. How serious do you take these calls? I don't know. I don't take much coming out of the U.S. very seriously. There have been pushes by RCAF ever since the Canadian border opened up with respect to live animal trade, to bring back country of origin labeling, to close the border. Certainly there will be pressures. The National Beef Producers Association and the processors really do not want that to happen. In ways, yeah, we had a huge shock, but we had a gradual reopening. So we were, everything was shut down. Then they opened the border to box beef from animals under 30 months. Eventually, they opened the border to the flow of the younger animals, and eventually culled animals and their meat was allowed to go. We faced a couple of challenges, BSE, country of origin labeling, over the last, 2 decades now. I don't know. It's always a pressure. I think, I am very worried about arguments about local food. I know it doesn't quite reach the scale, but effectively it's another form of protectionism. And I think as you have people pulling in, you have more and more protected markets.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move over to Ellen, and this might be the last question or close to the last question before we finish today. Ellen, I was thinking about going to a restaurant the other day because one of our local restaurants has opened up for business, but I was also feeling a bit cautious about it. And I wonder if you have some thoughts about the restaurant industry. Obviously, it's a huge employer within Canada. It has huge implications in terms of the economy and employment, as well as the time that people normally spend in restaurants enjoying themselves. I imagine there's a desire to get back into restaurants for many people. What do restaurants need to do really at this point to reinvent themselves, to make themselves viable within this sort of COVID context?
So, it's really interesting that the mix of restaurants and the size of restaurants and the location of restaurants that have evolved, say, over the past 20 years, have all been driven probably by economics to a great extent. You can only afford a certain size restaurant in really pricey real estate areas, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the reality is that the economics of eating out has changed dramatically. I'm not entirely sure. By the way, bars haven't reopened yet, and it's not clear to me that they will ever reopen in the size configuration and the number of patrons that were allowed in at a particular point in time ever again. But the economics has changed so significantly that people are going to have to be very creative about how to afford to run a restaurant. So for example, I think it's a good long period of time before people are not going to check whether the restaurant is sanitizing things in between clients, patrons, whatever you want to call us. And, that takes time. It costs money, requires the staff to be doing that, at which point they're not earning tips and you're going to have to change how you pay your staff, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Simple things like menus can no longer be reused, probably. We're probably seeing the end of that. We're going to be looking for menus that are disposable after a client has read them. Maybe it'll be all online. We may very well see more automation in restaurants as well as in food processing plants because of the fact that automated robots don't get sick. They can deliver food to a table. It won't be anywhere near as friendly or as chatty as it used to be, but I suspect. But they can certainly get the food from point A to point B and not get sick. So I think we're probably going to end up with restaurants being configured differently with more space, and all of those things are going to end up costing more than perhaps what they did in the past. Or we may see more ability to drive through restaurants and take it home. But I think at that point, it's just as easy to have somebody deliver it as it is to drive out and get it. So maybe restaurant meals are largely going to be eaten in the house.
Right.
Which is a different social experience entirely.
Exactly. And that was my experience recently. We ordered the restaurant food to the house. So I think that should be the end of our session today. I just want to make some final comments and reminders. So thank you for all of the questions. We have almost 120 questions. Those questions will be moved over to the discussion portal on eClass, and we'll do our best to try and answer as many of those questions as we can. So thank you for your participation. I also want to thank the panelists, both Ellen and James, for excellent presentations today. And I also want to thank the course organizers, Brent Swallow and Nargiza, for your coordination and organizing today. And I just want to send a reminder that the next session will be on horticulture value chains, and it will be at the same time and the same place on the internet on Thursday, May 28th. So with that, I want to thank all of you for participating today. I wish you a good day wherever you are in the world, and we look forward to seeing you here again in a few days. Thanks very much.